It took a long time to get seatbelt laws. It took a long time to see the truth on cigarettes. And, it might take a really long time. Like even those fights weren't up against money and power like big tech has. But I am confident that this love will win.
Kelly Stonelake is a business operator and technologist with nearly 15 years of experience at Meta, where she held senior roles in product marketing and organizational leadership. During her tenure, she raised concerns about child safety and internal misconduct and faced retaliation after an all-male leadership team chose to conceal risks rather than address them. The gap between Meta's stated values and her lived experience led to a severe loss of functioning and a fight for her life. Following her departure, Kelly became a whistleblower and advocate for stronger protections for children online, tech accountability, awareness of autistic burnout and suicide risk, and safer workplaces for marginalized people. Her work centers on challenging the concentration of power in technology and supporting efforts that advance equity, accountability, and systemic reform. Kelly recently testified in the Washington State Senate in support of SB 5708 on addictive feeds and SB 5784 on AI companions. In both testimonies, she recounts her firsthand experience in Horizon Worlds, speaking up about the open secret that they were collecting data on kids and exposing them to unknown adults without parental consent or controls, and the lengths Meta went to in order to protect the company instead of the kids. She speaks about how their sophisticated system of harassment and retaliation against those, especially women, who speak up about it ultimately ended her career in tech. Kelly is active on Substack, and I highly recommend her work. She can be found at overturned.substack.com. I'm so excited to share with you my conversation with Kelly Stonelake. Kelly, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Man, there were so many different periods of interest based on what I was into at that time. I was thinking about this the other day, and when I was in 8th grade, I was very into my school's newspaper. I was a writer for the school paper, the middle school paper, and I was very into the kind of political system, and I was doing constitutional debates in high school. And I was, I had read a quote at some point that we know we're healing when we come back to the things we were interested in as a young person. And so I've been thinking a lot about how that's kind of where I'm returning to, doing this sort of pseudo independent journalism aligned with the things I'm interested in on Substack, and being more involved than I ever imagined I would be with a legislative process, working to not only drive accountability for tech through my lawsuit or my discrimination and sexual harassment lawsuit, but also the work I'm doing at the federal and state level on child safety regulation.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating how it evolves. And I can't wait to hear the whole
It is.
arc. So you graduate university, college. I'm a Canadian. Where do you go? What happens?
Well, I had actually, I had started my first company before I started college or university, and I have half my family's Canadian, so you're in good company
Okay,
here.
good.
Or maybe I'm in good company. And while I was in school, I started working for Apple initially as part of their this program that they have called the Campus Rep program, which is basically like a distributed sales program where they embed folks in universities with product knowledge that can work with the bookstore and help with, tech help. And that's where I think my passion for technology and visibility into what the industry, how the industry operates behind closed doors, which at the time I found really inspiring. We were working on things like access to education, how to use technology to improve learning. I mean, all of this is, in hindsight, is pretty funny, dark comedy funny to me. But it was my boss at Apple that his name's Dave Morin. He's a pretty prominent VC figure in the Bay Area now. But he went to Facebook and was working on their third-party developer platform. And it was kind of, I think in 2008, I was in the middle of interviewing for a new job at Apple to go work in Cupertino. And I didn't get that job. And my understanding was that the team I was interviewing with had experienced some layoffs. And so Dave called me and said, I think you would really like it here at Facebook. We're working on these really big, complex problems, and it's this incredible mission driven organization. And, I didn't look back for almost 15 years, right? I moved down to California from Washington State in February of 2009. And that's
Mm.
when I started at Facebook, when it was, I think there were 600 or 700 employees. We were in a little office on University Avenue. And, that was the start of my experience there.
And from the consumer's perspective, remind us in 2009, what was Facebook?
So in 2009, Facebook had been released to kind of broad market consumption. It was after the kind of college only era, but before the advent of an algorithmic newsfeed. I remember, some of the debates that were happening when I joined was about, why do we only offer a like button? How about a thumbs down button? But the work I was doing when I joined on the third party developer platform I had joined to work with Dave and others on that work was really in the spirit of, what does a more open and accessible internet look like, where instead of it's hard not to smile thinking about the irony of so much of this, but instead of a world where one company owns your data, what if you could take that with you across different experiences? What does it look like when you have social gaming, when you have social listening, and, helping to not only imagine that vision, but then bring it to life. So I did that for about the first couple of years that I was working at Facebook.
Wow. I remember at that time, it was so exciting. We were all connecting with the people we went to like grade school with. And there was the
Yeah.
likes and the pokes, and your crush
Oh,
was
the
like
pokes.
married and over there, and it was like so exciting to find out what he was actually doing. Like all this, again, so innocent and not a thought. And I worked for a tech company at the time, a fintech company, as we call them now.
Hmm. Hmm.
Not a thought to anything wrong. It was just a game, right?
Yeah, I mean, the team I joined when I started at Facebook and working on the third party developer platform stuff, that was after the time that I had left and moved on to kind of other stuff within the company. But that was the technology we were working on really became the bedrock of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. And I think that
Wow.
those experiences really influenced some of my, like, what I would say now is radicalization around, Facebook and Meta's inherent goodness, as I thought for so long, because I sat in so many of these and participated in so many of these conversations about decisions we were going to make. And it was at that time really grounded in what was going to be best, not only for the people using our products, but what was going to be best for society, what was going to be
Mhm.
best for the internet. And Cambridge Analytica was the consequence of not only, I think, some ignorance, but also some kind of operational shortcomings where these were loopholes that were exploited by bad actors. And, my perspective at the time was, these are loopholes that the team I had left had proactively closed before um, the scandal had broke, like well before
Okay.
we came into awareness of this. And this never would have been the intention of the product. And I think that might have been true at the time, and I think it started this experience being on the inside and really influenced my experience in the years to follow of feeling like external pressure really misunderstood the work that we were doing there. External criticism was
Mm.
lacking critical context in order to really understand what was happening. And I think started what a lot of employees there have told me they've experienced, and I conclude they must continue experiencing, which is this sort of cognitive dissonance and ultimately like an avoidance mechanism of like it couldn't be. And I think what I think most people miss about that, I see the comments, I see the criticism I get when I say stuff like that. But for years, we really made decisions based on what was going to be the best thing for the people, the communities we serve, what the best thing was going to be for the mission. I was promoted for a decade for saying no to money and for raising the bar on how we were regulated. And now I look back at all of that and think, that was certainly the most effective way to grow, to gain power. And darn if that power hasn't been completely abused. And, it's
Mm.
just a really interesting evolution to reflect on.
It is. I'm hanging on your every word because I'm dying to understand, and I don't even know how much you are able to explain kind of because it feels like from the top, the change is massive. Like, was it
Yeah.
always like, is this a Machiavellian situation? Have we been duped the whole time? Or like, has it been an evolution? Do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that, but that's a question I ask myself a lot. One of the earlier pieces I wrote on my Substack was this idea that power is a principle, meaning, I loved and had a fierce loyalty to the company for so long because I watched the company and our leaders, including Mark Zuckerberg, who when I started sat across the hall, across the floor from me, return time and time again to mission, to principles. And it was really confusing and almost like being in and watching a slow motion car crash to see some of the decisions that were being made. And my conclusion in that piece, and I think the closest I can get to a conclusion when I reflect on it, is that I think that Mark was and is playing a game of risk with society and democracy and people's livelihood, and that for a very long time the path to accumulating power, influence, and ultimately what seems like a lot of impunity was a progressive, principled approach
Mm.
to building the internet. And I wasn't a part of I started as an hourly employee, like level 2 of, I don't know, it's like 10 or 12 by the time you're a VP. But I was a director 8 years later. I mean, which is, I don't know, 7 promotions. And even then, like I was working on for most of the time I was at Meta. For the 10 years in the middle, I was working on this organization called Creative Shop, which was effectively like a internal creative agency working to think about how do we take business goal, our advertisers' business goals and help them be effective with the technology, the ad tech that we have, but also create really positive experiences for people so that it's not just like whatever's going to win the auction, which
Mm.
sweatshirt is going to be more effective on this model kind of a thing. And, even then, I wasn't a part of conversations about the product that we were ultimately bringing to the consumer. I was thinking really deeply about the businesses that I was and in the industries that my teams were working on. And it wasn't until, getting to Horizon ultimately, which was the first consumer product I worked on and the only
Mm.
one in the almost 15 years I worked there, where not only was it a consumer product, but I was in the kind of senior most group of product leaders that were making decisions about that. And I mean, it was a record scratch. Like it was an abrupt shift. And I don't know if it was like that in the senior most rooms on consumer products for 5, 10 years before that or not. But I know that when I got there, there was a culture of ultimately a complete disregard, not only for the people that we were supposed to be creating value for, but also for employees who gave a shit about it.
Wow. So that was the beginning of your change in relationship to the
Yeah,
company.
when I was asked to take on that opportunity, I was thrilled. I had been working, I had done the creative shop thing. And then Brian Boland, who's actually the senior most person to come out and criticize the company, he was a VP before he left. 2020, I vividly remember, sitting on my back porch and getting a call from him asking if I was interested in product marketing, which was effectively not only taking the market to the product, informing what are we building, but then how do we take the product to the market? Not so much the actual marketing campaigns, but more the business kind of function that's embedded within the engineers and the product leaders who sort of, for lack of a better metaphor, like or analogy, quarterbacks with all of the non-technical functions and gets not only the information they need, but thinks about what regulations are required in various markets, what the sequencing of a launch should look like, who the audience should be, and the product that was the developer platform. Now, I've been gone from developer platform. This is Cambridge Analytica has happened. We now have a FTC consent order, which is basically this like massive auditing project that we need to fulfill. And it was an opportunity to come back in and try to think about how do we make the third party like data sharing products better, safer, and more aligned with not only what the market needs, but what our customer, how to fulfill our commitments to our customers and how to be really kind of long-term strategic about that. And I loved that work and did really well. It was a big shift, but it was kind of in that function. They moved my whole team and my boss to the metaverse organization, and it would have been early 2022. And the woman who was doing my job, product marketing director, I was on developer platform and she was on Horizon Worlds. She was getting ready to go out on a long, as they were at the company, a long maternity leave, parental leave. She's about to have her first kid. And they asked me, Kelly, we really think that you would be an amazing director to kind of fill these shoes while she's gone. And it was not just this sort of, yes, technically an interim capacity, but in this 6-7 months that she was going to be gone, the ask was, we need to take this product, which has been this sort of passion project that sat within this experimental kind of area of the company, and we need to basically turn it into Roblox. Like we need to launch to devices other than just the Oculus headset. It was the social layer of the Oculus headset, like not necessarily the games and apps, but when you get on and you're in a world that you can meet people and build experiences. So we need to
for people,
expand that to cross screens. Oh, sorry.
Can you just circle back a little for the people who aren't as tech?
Yeah.
Because I want them to really get this.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about a virtual reality, if I'm not mistaken, a kind of gaming product for children. Is that
well,
correct?
technically at the time that this was all happening, technically kids weren't allowed in the product. But yes, we're talking about, if you kind of imagine, if you saw like Mark Zuckerberg's videos and keynotes around turning into Meta and launching the metaverse and the avatars that didn't have legs, like those are Horizon avatars. Like that's the kind of world we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, technically kids weren't allowed in the product, which is part of what makes what I soon discovered so problematic. But yeah, it was expand to mobile, expand to international markets, and expand to teenagers, and then eventually kids.
Okay.
And
I just
at the
learned what
time,
Roblox was, so that's why because I don't have kids, so I just want to make sure everyone's alongside with you because it's really important.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I think my knowledge of Roblox at the time was that it was I thought it was like Minecraft. I thought it was a creativity app, and my kids who are now 7, 10, and 12 were obviously a few years younger and loved Roblox. And I think I had set up the controls in a way, or they were playing in experiences such that I had never seen any of the concerns that I now understand are pretty rampant in that product, and that I learned quickly in my job at Horizon. But initially I thought, how cool, like Roblox is a hero in my house and I get to work on this project that's going to put Meta into that game. That makes a lot of sense to me. But, I was at the time I joined the only woman on a leadership team that was all men who had been basically operating with a blank check, like literally and figuratively, like a blank check mentality as well. With, we're just going to be figuring out how to build the coolest platform here. And my job was to make it a successful product in the market. And what I experienced right away was several things. There was, you join a new team, and it's pretty standard in the corporate world, at least at Meta, to do something we call the listening tour, which is, where I'm going to be meeting with all sorts of people, asking lots of questions, figuring out what are the pain points, what are the opportunities. And the same stuff was surfacing from almost every woman I spoke to, which was like immediately almost waterworks, like these huge kind of like held back emotions. People were traumatized around the culture of misogyny within this organization, where the men that in my new peer group that were running this product were doing things like assigning work to women, and then they would bring that work to a product review and they would be humiliated and shamed for why they would choose to work on that. And there was a guy named Jeff Lynn, was, Horizon was kind of his baby. Like he was the product design director, but he was particularly demeaning. It was reported to me that he was particularly um, demeaning and cruel toward women. And turns out, you know, his former partner, who was a prominent online gamer, has a whole like YouTube expose about the domestic abuse and psychological abuse she experienced in relationship with this guy. And it's like no surprise in hindsight. But I also had people like the marketing director. So this is the person who's responsible to actually execute the marketing campaigns, coming to me and saying, I have a lot of concerns about our ability to be successful because the product doesn't really work as well as it should. Like people don't stay in the product for a couple of reasons. There's product stability issues, but also it's like overwhelmingly kids using this product. And this is important because they're using it using adult accounts, which means we're violating federal law because we're collecting tens of thousands of pieces of data on these folks without any parental consent. But also it's a problem because we are putting children in a virtual space with adults who can say, hey, what's your address? What's your phone number? Let's talk on WhatsApp. I mean, it was uh, children are in these virtual bars and virtual strip clubs and getting bullied and groped and
Oh, good.
she's like, I have concerns that we're going to put, you could imagine how much money might be spent on a marketing budget to do a big launch and expansion of this. And if for those who are marketers, like we call that a leaky funnel. Like if people are going to come in and exit, like we're not going to be able to move them down. And she's like, I worry that this is going to be successful. And, I'm gathering all this information. And when I brought, whatever the next meeting was with my peer group, I said, hey, we need to talk about these concerns that Carrie's raising. Carrie was the marketing director. And Jeff Lynn, the product design director, said, yeah, Kelly, we need to talk about these concerns and we need you to shut her up. And it was positioned as an opportunity for me to prove myself. Like, oh, we've heard you're super talented, Kelly. We've heard let's see if you're as good as they say. And it was appalling on so many levels. And then this is also against a backdrop where the issue of kids in the product isn't being talked about in the context of how are we putting kids potentially in harm's way? Are we concerned about breaking federal law? And I've just come from a world where we're like working 100 hours a week to avoid paying the $5 billion FTC fine after being, and I couldn't believe the disregard, not only for the people, but also for the like the fragile state of trust that I think the public had with Facebook and or Meta. My mindset at the time was still, it's really misunderstood and those were mistakes, but we're doing our best to solve them. And then here we are, like, are we serious? Like, we're just going to do this again? And we were explicitly told, don't take notes about anything related to kids. If you need to have a conversation about children and the product, it's got to be in a document that's attorney-client privileged. It's got to be with a lawyer present so that these items aren't discoverable. I mean, all of this is illegal. And, obviously I wasn't, I think I still was in this mindset. Like, these are, I mean, I hate to say, but I mean, bad people within a good system was still sort of my mindset. And I need to continue pushing on this and escalating this until we pause this rollout, because we can't take this product and open it up to kids technically when we have an overwhelming majority of the folks using this product are already kids and we don't have solutions there. And what ended up happening is I was pretty soon the weekly meeting with that leadership team vanished from my calendar. And my boss at the time was on a sabbatical. And I tried various ways to get myself back into that room, reaching out to the leaders the VP whose decision that was. It was Vishal Shah and Vivek Sharma and their admin teams. And, the message I got was that there were concerns about confidentiality, that there were concerns that I was in an interim role, even though I was the person at the company responsible to execute these expansions, and that I was going to need to figure out how to do my work without access to those rooms. And, I did. We did pause the rollout while I was still there. We
Okay.
paused the rollout
Wow.
of that product. It was Vishal, one of the men who now is, he just recently moved from leading metaverse product at Meta to working on their AI product. But he had a very public, flashy, called it a quality pause, that we were going to pause the expansion of Horizon due to some product quality issues. No mention, obviously, of anything related to the issue with kids. And, I'm jumping in the timeline a bit here, but like in the last one of the final straws a few months later, before my mental health collapse and me leaving on my medical leave, was being told by my boss, who wasn't in those rooms at first, but was my kind of functional leader on product marketing, that who had, when he had returned from his sabbatical, had basically told me that he wasn't going to use his political capital to get me back into that room, but that, he would go and he would kind of be an agent for get me the information that I needed and so forth. But he, at the very end, apologized to me for not doing more to, that it was a mistake to not do more to get me back into the room. But he also told me, and this was the second performance cycle that I heard something like this from him, that he wouldn't be able to recognize me for the work I did driving that product pause, the launch pause, because of how it would expose the shortcomings of Vishal, of the senior male leaders on the product. And I really think, I mean, this is someone that professionally, like, I deeply respect, and I think was actually trying to do me a favor. It's in processing so much of that as I recovered from what was a life-threatening mental health collapse, that I realized how, so much of what I'd experienced, from like more overt sexual harassment, threats of, sleep with me or you won't be promoted in the early Wild West days of Facebook, all the way through to that conversation, were symptoms of a systematic disregard for women. And that the price of that disregard was not only employees' health and livelihood, but also I was watching this disregard be coded directly into this product and these products that are going to
That's
scale
right.
to millions and millions of customers with a target for children. And it's no surprise that since I've left, there's been reporting on how misogynistic Horizon is as an experience. Laura Bates did a big
Oh my
feature on
God.
that in The Guardian, I think. And
Terrifying.
there's been Senate testimony from folks who were while I was there, I didn't know them, but while I was there, they were researchers in Horizon being told to cover up and change the findings that they were landing on related to kids in the product. So that's all been really validating, but in a way that's, I
Yeah,
wish it was never necessary. I wish that
of
the
course.
company would have taken these concerns more seriously and addressed them.
So I have two questions. I mean, I have a ton of questions. I have two questions. I'm going to give you them both because I want to make sure we cover both. One is
Mhm.
I want to know from your perspective, what are the exact dangers of the product that and of Meta in general that parents and therapists and social workers, like the people who listen to this podcast, need to understand in very specific ways. And then I want to
Mhm.
continue with your personal story. They're not separate. I love how you understand, like it's all coming from the same place. So where would you want to
Yeah.
go?
Well, the harms in Horizon are one piece of a bigger puzzle of broad social media harms. And I'd love to talk about that breadth. I think that, what's really interesting is that Meta, and many of their peers has such a sophisticated internal propaganda, external propaganda, PR engine to make it seem like these are issues they really care about and are doing something about. Even though my direct experience was in the context of Horizon, which, those risks look like addiction, exploitation, predation, grooming. What happened was seeing firsthand the degree of disregard for breaking there's not a lot of laws that exist to protect children online, but total disregard for breaking those, but also things like, let's imply we have, there was this like 2-week gap in when the parental controls would be ready and when they wanted teens to have access to the product. And it was like, we can imply we have parental controls where we don't. The controls were never about actually keeping kids safe. And so what happened for me was that experience and kind of coming to kind of process that sort of forced this reckoning of all of this other information that I had kind of, I think, tuned out over the years of like Instagram's bad for teens, and here's the concern around algorithmic harms, because I'm thinking, well, no, like there are people as committed as I am to the work I'm doing focused on solving this. And then once you see, oh no, like the priority is protecting the company, protecting profits, not protecting kids, I began taking a lot of those other concerns a lot more seriously and building a lot of relationships with families whose children have died due to some of these various social media harms. So I think, just like off the top of my head, the things that come to mind most prominently, there was a lawsuit just this last week of a young man who joined Instagram and was dead 2 or 3 days later due to a sextortion scheme. And this is happening a lot, where especially for young heteronormative boys primarily are targeted by these groups of predators that will send them nudes of young
Oh,
girls and claiming to be a member of their community and new to the town or whatever, and ask for nudes in return. And they send them, and then the criminals are basically threatening the kid, like, if you're not going to send me money, I'm going to put this everywhere and ruin your life. The pipeline from that to suicide is, in the case I just mentioned, it was a matter of a couple of days. There are other cases coming to my mind right now where it was like hours, a matter of a few hours.
oh my God.
On the suicide piece, there's multiple kind of other pipelines to via social media to teen suicide. One of them is bullying, online bullying, which is often from other kids, sometimes from adults, but, especially especially platforms like Snapchat, which have this disappearing ephemeral nature, and you can, in Instagram messages set it up similarly, where there's really there's anonymity and impunity for folks to terrorize
Oof.
young people. I don't know, this picture behind me, this young woman right here, Grace, took her life after experiencing relentless cross-platform bullying for an
That was
extended period of time. And while bullying is a tale as old as time, having the power of tech and anonymity behind you
oh, yeah,
changes the dynamic so significantly, where you used to be able to come home and get a reprieve from
that's right.
mean kids at school, and now they can find you and reach you across multiple platforms all hours of the day. Many of these kids have stories that look like blocking people, changing their accounts, getting off platform for long periods of time. And, these aren't enough. This is an area where the companies that are making money off of kids compulsively getting online to bully one another, or to like see, oh gosh, what's been said? What are my peers all seeing? What's been posted about me? There's not really an incentive for them to change that, because, they consider themselves untouchable in the courtroom, in the courthouse, and limiting access here would significantly impact their profits. Another pipeline for suicide is the algorithmic kind of nature of these feeds. Like you and I, we're not on most of these platforms anymore, but our experience as older folks, if you will, not teenagers, not, you look at millennials and Gen X, like we experience news feeds that look like our friends' vacation photos and,
Right.
birth announcements and things like that. And, our news feeds are really sophisticated at giving us the content that we're going to be most interested in. That's why a lot of us even are seeing more polarizing political content. But for kids, they don't have networks of people, posting these details about their, these family announcements, or, they might not be as interested in some of the political content, but Meta knows what they are interested in. TikTok knows what they are interested in. And I've seen many cases of kids who turn to social media in a time of extreme vulnerability, like in the wake
Mm,
of a breakup. I'm
mm,
looking for inspiration, comfort, what to do when I'm sad. And
mm.
the pipeline gets, from there to here's why
Oof.
you should kill yourself. Here's how to kill yourself. The documentary Can't Look Away, which I highly recommend, follows the case of Mason Edens, who, his mom not only shares her 911 call, but shares the content that he saw on TikTok that was like, it's like her hand, his hand, your hand, here's a gun, and it's unbelievable. And this is content that circulates without, like, with total impunity.
God.
Mm. I think about a lot of families whose kids have died due to acquiring drugs via social media that maybe they thought was
Yeah.
ecstasy or oxy or ketamine or MDMA, and it's laced with fentanyl. And I think about people like Alexander Neville, or there's a parent I met named Matt Revere, whose two sons died the same night in bed next to each other. And, what I think is missed about this, where folks think, oh, the criticism is, oh, well, these kids shouldn't be doing drugs in the first place. And it's like, okay, I can hear that argument. And kids have been experimenting since the dawn of time. The
Yeah.
difference now is that we have tech companies that are facilitating the
That's right.
connection between predators who know that they're offering kids products that are unsafe, that are counterfeit, and are doing it anyway. And there's like very little, you know, very few examples of times when those folks are actually held to account, and so far almost no examples of where the technology companies are. On Snapchat, you have things like your Snap score, which is based on the number of connections that you have. And if a drug dealer gets in with a single kid in a high school, pretty soon they're going to be recommended to all of their kids, all of that
Totally.
kid's friends. And once you're connected, you can actually, there's snap maps and you can see on a map where kids are. I mean, it's wild.
And all it takes
And
is one teenager who's not thinking. Like, and they by definition, they're not ready to make those decisions. It's
yeah, like
devastating.
this is
It's
why
devastating.
Australia's taken social media off the table for folks under 16 is there's a reason why a 17-year-old can't go buy booze or go to a
Exactly.
casino. You don't have fully developed prefrontal lobes, and things like decision making, impulse control, are not in the same place as they would be for someone in their late 20s or 30s. But in addition to that, you have this kind of manufactured dependency, and
Yeah.
addiction and reliance on these products where, they're meant to feel like a safe place, both for kids and parents want you to, they want parents to feel safe and comfortable. And like, earlier this year, Instagram launched teen accounts, which is supposed to be, they called it the PG-13 rated version of Instagram, which, the Motion Picture Association was like,
Yeah.
please don't use that
Excuse me.
rating. Yeah. But what really pissed me off in that announcement is they said, "Oh, we're going to limit, not only access to harmful content, pro-suicide content, eating disorder content, but also uh, viral challenges." And that's another area of harm where you have, I mean, these extremely good-natured, curious, intellectually curious kids who are like, I see the social proof of all my friends trying these, I can force some temporary asphyxiation and get a high off of that. And here's a video on how to do that. And then they're dead. And, these kids have been dying from like the choking challenge, for instance. Judy Rogg, who's a friend of mine, her son Eric died in 2010. And so this is
Oh my
like,
God.
for Instagram to say, we spent 3 months working on this product and now you're not going to, if you opt into Instagram Teens, you're not going to see these challenges. It's like this was a direct response to their fear of legislation. And so they
Yeah.
did the bare minimum only because they were afraid to try to make parents and lawmakers more comfortable. But, I wrote a piece about how these protections are sugar pills for parents that make them feel more comfortable without actually protecting their kids because Heat Initiative and Parents SOS and Arturo Behar and a couple of universities audited the Instagram teen accounts and found that the majority of time, the features that they claimed to have did not work as described. And to me, this is just criminal. I mean, there's no other way to,
Utterly criminal.
yeah, it's how do we make parents feel safer giving their kids access to our products so that we can keep making money while on the other side of our mouth we're going to talk about this being a parenting issue.
Wild.
It's unconscionable.
So what happens, Kelly? You start to become aware of these things. You probably start to see it everywhere. You're recapitulating your career. I mean, this is a devastating experience. What happens for you?
Yeah, well, it's the degree to which companies like this operate like a cult or using dynamics of
Mm,
coercive control similar to, what unfortunately many of us have experienced in interpersonal relationships. It's only really become clear to me in hindsight, but even after experiencing at Horizon what I've just described, I still thought that this was a matter of, that the product rollout had been paused. I'm thinking, okay, like goodness will prevail here. We're going to get this figured out. These will be addressed. I'm really disappointed with how these specific leaders are talking about and thinking about this responsibility. But it's my job to make sure that we do this right. And I have a huge opportunity to drive influence here. And
yeah.
when I started, really experiencing uh, overwhelming urges to end my life, I was still working there. And I mean, it's sick in hindsight. My thought process was, it's not good for the company or for my coworkers if I'm this I was like I was crying, and I'm all for crying at work, but I was bursting into tears with in context where it might not have fully made sense to, like a harmless joke or a pretty normal like level of interpersonal conflict is even a strong word, but the cross-functional partners want to have a negotiation about what we do when and where, and that was just overwhelming to me. And I thought, I had in the product marketing organization, that's the kind of function that was distributed amongst all of the Reality Labs teams, which is, it included Metaverse, also included the actual Oculus hardware, the, Ray-Ban glasses, all that. There were, I think something like 20 or 25 of us that were directors or VPs. It was like 4 or 5 of that group were women. And by the time I started experiencing urges to end my life, um, one of those women was out on maternity leave, the previous Horizon leader, but the 4 of us left, like I was the third that was heading out on a medical leave. And so you can kind of and all of us were basically in positions of having to hold power hungry men to account because we were the ones responsible for actually making durable, sustainable, responsible business. And there was this sort of meme going around that the other 2 women who had left on these leaves, that these were just their kind of quiet exits. And I thought that was really sad. Not that they were exiting. I think, I'm big fans of these people, and like, especially in hindsight, like, yeah, get out of there. But I thought it was really sad that people were afraid to take leave because of how it might be perceived. And so even like the degree of to which I was totally radicalized in this, like, my job is to, you know, do whatever's best for this company, and I'm going to continue doing this even as I'm deteriorating. I had thought, okay, I'm going to take a leave and I'm going to show the folks looking to me that not only is it safe to take a leave, but that you can do it, get better, and return. And that was 100% my mindset still when that started. I did all sorts of. It turns out I was incredibly impaired. Like, I have learned so much about what it looks like when I'm autistic and ADHD, but when neurodivergent people experience this idea of a moral injury, like this conflict, this values conflict. And what happened for me, it wasn't, I wanted to kill myself, but I couldn't form words. I couldn't get my arms and legs to work the ways I was expecting them to. I couldn't get out
Wow.
of bed. I couldn't handle, even the smallest like interpersonal or emotional hurdle without completely melting down, becoming, like her huddling into a ball and rocking back and forth and just thinking, how do I end this? Right. It was really, really bad. And because of my ignorance about what was actually happening, and because of, I mean, there's so much misogyny rooted in like how it turns out what I experienced is pretty textbook for what autistic burnout looks like, especially for women who have spent their lives masking. I was, it was the providers I was seeing at the time thought, oh, this is just treatment resistant depression. And I did all sorts of things. I mean, I know you've got a lot of experience with, alternative approaches. I tried ketamine. I tried TMS. I went every day and had a magnet strapped to my head. I tried behavioral activation, right? And found that I was just in other places wanting to die. And it wasn't until finding dialectical behavioral
Mm.
therapy, which is really, a modality of therapy to support suicidal people and folks with emotional dysregulation issues, that I began co- learning to find not only acceptance of where I was, but realizing that I wasn't really feeling the feelings that came with, wanting to die was a way to, I think, symptom of needing to avoid what ultimately was devastation at not only what I'd experienced, but what all the implications were. The fact that this meant I had spent 15 years of my life building a company that I now knew harmed vulnerable people, and coming to terms with like, man, I didn't, and of course you have to have so much compassion for yourself. But when I was
Yes.
21 and threatened to, like, if I don't have sex with my boss or I won't get promoted, it's like, yeah, I didn't have sex with my boss, but I should have reported that. Like, I should have, like, the version of me that could go live through those experiences again, because I had kind of built the pattern of how, as I said
Yeah.
earlier, like, all of this was part of the systemic disregard for women. But it was in that work that work, the DBT work, which was, it's still ongoing. Like, I still meet weekly with a DBT therapist, but at a time it was like 3 times a week. I kind of came to this place where it's like, if I don't live in my values, I am at risk. And so figuring out, well, what does telling the truth look like, and how
Right.
can I be effective? And I was still, I think I like kind of just started the DBT stuff when I was about 8 months into my leave, and my boss had reached out to me, and HR had reached out to me, and they'd asked for kind of updates while I had been out, and all of my updates were like, I'm working on it. I'm really not at a place I can come back, but I am so excited to. And we talked about the job I would come back to. And after 8 months, they laid me off. And I understand that. Like, I understand that they wanted to backfill that role, but it wasn't part of one of the kind of mass layoffs, as far as I know. It was just like, we need to move on. And it was the big turning point for me, and kind of that reconciliation of values, was when I got the severance paperwork. Yeah, they were offering me a huge amount of money, and the last page of the contract, where you sign, it says, I hold Meta harmless. I am actively working on reconciling the fact that I had, you know, my life had been threatened by my actions and my values not
Right.
aligning, even though I was kind of an unwitting participant in that for so long. And I just thought, I can't sign this, because not only do I
Mhm.
know that I'm walking away from this dumpster fire that is scalding the women on my team and those on the margins, otherwise, that I'm walking away from, that this is bad for kids, this is bad for democracy, this is bad for vulnerable groups. And I retained a lawyer, and there was a kind of brief effort to figure out if we could come to an agreement that would, I'm limited in exactly what I can share about it, but that would demonstrate accountability on their part, and not just, trying to pay to kind of walk away with a agreement. And they through that process, it was very clear that, you know, I think even still, that was a company that I thought would have been hungry for understanding what went wrong and how to
Mm.
make it better. And that was non-existent. And, it just really pissed me off that they thought that money was what it would take to make me go away. And so, we went quiet on that. And
So you did not sign and did not
no,
receive money.
no, yeah, no
Wow.
severance. I mean, it was blood money is how it felt.
I want to recognize that, because that is a rare thing. That one of the core sicknesses of our culture is the eminence of money. So for you to
Yeah, I mean, oops, sorry. I think we were on a delay.
Oh, okay. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was yeah, I mean,
I'll fix it in a minute.
we're
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, sorry. I think, what's really important about that is that I was, telling the truth and saying no to a severance agreement is also a function of privilege. And I would be remiss
Mhm.
to not highlight the fact that working at Meta for 15 years not only gave me a huge commitment to principled decision making, which
Mhm,
is what I thought the company was, but also I had financial privilege that
mhm.
many other people don't. And so I understand that not everyone is in a position where they can do the same thing that I did. But for me, I was struggling with the fact that I, was living in a house that had been paid for by this company that I now thought was
Yeah.
evil. And my principle was that if I lose everything in, holding them to account and telling the truth of what I experienced, at least I can live with myself. Like I grew
Right.
up poor. I'm not afraid of having no money. Like I'm way more afraid of having no principles and no
Mm.
ethics. And that's, I think, a unique outcome of not only my life experiences, but my privilege. But yeah, we filed the lawsuit in February of this year. And,
And what are you suing them
there
for?
are yeah, well, the lawsuit is sexual harassment and gender-based discrimination and retaliation because of the nature of being the kind of only woman on the team, doing my job, being punished for doing my job, being asked to silence other women. But also, I include in my complaint a an entire history of um, the time my time there, which included, as I've alluded to a couple of times in this conversation, a boss from 2010 who was all the things you imagine, like when really built um, a trusting and connected, this like we're a family team culture, attended my wedding, and then 3 months later, put his hands down my pants on a work trip and told me that, a couple months after that, that if I didn't have sex with him, I wasn't going to be promoted. And, that guy, all the way through to, I had a boss in 2020, kind of, he was my boss for years, but before I left the creative shop, who, um, when George Floyd was murdered, he made his profile picture like a Blue Lives Matter logo. And, I had conversations with him about how, hey, this is a counter movement to Black Lives Matter. We were leading this creative organization that was diverse. And I'm talking about, hey, we might want to think about how this is going to land not only with our teammates, but also in the context. At the time, I thought I was working for a progressive company that was going to put people and social issues first, and this is in misalignment with your kind of responsibility to represent Facebook and Meta. And, he retaliated against me pretty significantly with a lot of extremely like gendered put downs and dismissal. And this is after, this is the guy who did nothing when one of my male peers told me I would be more successful if I acted less smart. And this is the same boss who told me that I reminded him of a woman he worked with at Leo Burnett, who no one liked because she was always right. Just stuff like that. That is like all the paper cuts that so many women experience in so many different forms, in so many different industries.
Mhm.
And the reason why I go back and include all of that in my complaint is there's a kind of legal responsibility to establish a pattern, but also because what I thought were bad apples this entire time in a system that was inherently good, it's like I realized, wow, all of this is connected. All of this is about
Mm.
disregard for women. And,
Mhm.
you know, and that's being encoded into the product. And I also, on the kid safety stuff, filed a sworn statement with the Federal Trade Commission in April, right after my lawsuit, and have really gone. My capacity is still really impaired. I couldn't return to a job. I'm blackballed for doing what I've done, but even if there were folks calling me up for work, like I can do an interview like this as long as I, don't have any other demands or commitments for like the 24 hours before and after. And,
Mhm.
I'm still recovering. And so, but the capacity I do have, I am using that my principle there is like anytime I can show up and tell the truth of what I experienced in a way that keeps kids safer or contributes to a conversation about the way we treat women and other marginalized people at work, if I have the capacity to, I'm going to do that.
And I have so much respect for that choice and can really relate to reduced capacity and being very intentional. And I'm so grateful you're here sharing with my audience because I know that many people are really going to benefit. You have the kind of clarity that is obviously hard won.
And the irony, Allison, is like I learned that at Facebook. It was the way that decisions were made, for
Mm,
so long and in so many,
right.
obviously not everywhere, but in so many contexts that I was a part of until the end. It was, we're going to do the right thing, even if it costs us. And I was rewarded for that for a very long time. And it's really interesting. I think I wrote in one piece when I was talking about Careless People by Sarah Wynne Williams that it's just really interesting to me that a company teaches us to be principled and to do the right thing, even if it might not be the easiest thing, and then seems surprised when we do.
Preparing to talk to you, I was going back in my memories to when I started at Goldman Sachs, and we have principles, or not we anymore, but they have principles. And one of the principles reminds me so much of your story. It's we are long term greedy. And we were taught
I love
so
that.
deeply, right, to think strategically about doing what's right in order to make money.
Mm,
It's finance, so
yeah.
we
Yes.
were not
Yes.
mission driven, right? But I kept
Yeah.
thinking about that because I discovered over time, of course, that the ethics there are no better.
Hmm.
But there is this covering over, and it is kind of crazy making.
Hmm. Yeah, it is really interesting because you can experience that and think this is ethical and this is about, not taking shortcuts in order to maximize profit, right? Or whatever. And that is definitely can be one interpretation of it. And it can be, I think as we both experience at companies with principles like that, that it can also be a means to an end to accumulate power. And when you have enough power, especially in a capitalist patriarchal society, you get closer and closer to actual impunity, to actual, as Mark Zuckerberg would love to be, emperorship of an extraction instead of even being expected to kind of continue with those principles.
Okay, so I want to switch gears, but before we do that, can you say a couple things that parents can do from your perspective that are super important for parents to understand? I would not want to end this without hearing that from you.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the first thing is that parents should give themselves permission to reevaluate decisions that they've made about their kids' technology use with more information. When it was in 2020, each one of my three kids got an iPad that they used a lot. And now they don't use those iPads. I mean, I had my 7-year-old, I mean, she experienced real grief when I took that away. I think it's about being, our job as parents is to make the best decisions with the information that we have. And we have to be really compassionate with ourselves because I think what stops a lot of parents from doing more here is this we all are many of us are addicted to our devices in our own way, and it kind of validates that, but also changing our mind or changing our approach to something sort of inherently requires acknowledging that maybe we didn't make the best decision the first time. I was in that boat, but being
Mm-hmm.
self-compassionate that we are part of a system that benefits from us making those decisions and that we made the best decisions available to us. But, my approach now, my kids won't have access to a kind of responsive mobile device, be it an iPad or a smartphone until, when my oldest is 12, when he's driving, I would love him to have a device that allows him to communicate and us to,
Yeah.
communicate with one another. But it's interesting because he was 10 when he was the only kid on his hockey team who didn't have a phone, and that was really hard
Right.
for him. And now we obviously talk about this stuff a lot at home. And he said to me the other day, like, I don't want to have a smartphone till I'm 18. And it's like, okay, so who knows?
Mm,
Maybe he'll have a flip phone when he's driving. But I would say delay smartphone use as long as possible. And then certainly I would, if my advice is no social media. I understand that a lot of the guidance these days is 16 and under, and that's what, Australia just did. For me, in my house, it will look like no social media, period.
right.
I have had my own experiences struggling with addiction to social media. I've experienced the expansiveness that comes with stepping away from most of these platforms. And when you think about what kids are up against and the, US Surgeon General's advisory and the addictive nature, the relationship between addiction and smartphone or depression and anxiety and smartphone use, the data is remarkably clear that spending, more than, I think the last piece of data I looked at, more than less than an hour a day looking at a responsive screen has significant impacts on anxiety,
Mm,
depression, actually results in like divergent brain development, differences in learning. And so, we something else that I think is really interesting, Allison, is that an argument I hear a lot is like, my kid needs access to this stuff or else they're not going to be technologically literate.
yeah.
And it's important to remember that Mark Zuckerberg himself and Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and all of these founding fathers of our digital age, they didn't have smartphones. They didn't use products like this. And they were doing things like, spending time pursuing their passions, learning how to code. So, we have a family computer. It sits in a public place in the, middle of the house. And my kids have restricted, but, still access to, if my daughter loves to read books on via Sora on the computer. My girls love, there's a coding app. They've, you know, use Duolingo and try to learn languages. And, there's other things that we do, like they have a, chomp saw is like it's a, cardboard table saw. And like, there's ways to bring technology into your house without it needing to be, products that fill the pockets of billionaires who have no regard for the fact that they're killing kids, right? Like there is space. There's still lots of
Yes.
space for that to exist. And, that's what I really encourage parents to think about is my kids' access to this product, is the time they spend filling the pockets of predatory billionaires. And if so, it's
Mhm.
probably not safe for them, because turns out predatory billionaires don't make product decisions based on what's safest for the people whose products,
Right.
who use their products.
And you mentioned privilege earlier, and this is something I think about a lot too, because what you're saying here is you're encouraging parents to think about technology and to think about the economics behind the technology. And again, this is something that makes me very angry about the situation we're in. It makes me angry about AI as well, because you are expecting people to have a kind of capacity for all the different
Mhm.
reasons. Economic, like there's so many reasons
Mhm.
why people don't have the capacity to make that kind of a complex decision about their children. And people are
Mhm.
stretched, wildly
Mhm.
stretched, and their
Mhm.
kids are having access to things and we didn't ask for it. Like it's not like road hockey where it's like, I know what you're doing. Like you have no idea what
Mhm.
they're doing
Mhm.
on the phone. No idea. These AI
Mhm.
products, if you don't have a job that exposes you to AI, it's just coming down and your kids could be anywhere
Mhm.
and you have no idea. So I find this so concerning.
I'm so glad you said that, because that's something that really upsets me too about big tech's sort of orientation toward saying that this is a parenting thing, when, it just seems so out of touch. Like I was an only child to a single mom, and I was a latchkey kid. And had my timeline been 20 years different, I would have been a YouTube kid for sure. And I think that there's just a total like incapacity to imagine anything other than we have infinite time and resources. And what is the most criminal to me about it is that these companies as I talked about, like the sugar pills, like offer products that are meant to make parents feel better about handing their companies' services and products off to their kids, but that don't actually keep them safe. It's incredibly manipulative. And I also, so I think there's like a societal class, wound forming here. And then I also think that there's a huge disability justice issue here in the sense that, as I mentioned, I'm autistic, ADHD, my kids are, and I'm working on a piece about this right now, but almost every family I've met who's lost a kid to social media harms, whose kids have tried the viral challenge or ended their life after sextortion or bullying or after seeing, algorithmic encouragement or AI chatbots telling them they should take their life. These kids are overwhelmingly neurodivergent. And it makes sense when you think about differences in social emotional development, isolation, impulse control. Neurodivergent people tend to be more susceptible to abuse, more likely to trust, a friendly face. And I'm pretty fired up about that too, because it's, also true that I think neurodivergent people grow up into adults who are more likely to think, what is this? Is this okay?
Hmm.
What are we accepting? And I just think that there's something particularly dark about the fact that this generation of kids that we're losing to corporate greed are, from my observations, overwhelmingly neurodivergent.
That is fascinating. I had not
Hmm.
heard or thought about that before. It makes so much sense when you say it, and incredibly
Hmm.
disturbing.
Incredibly disturbing. And I think as far as, messages to parents, I'd say if your kid's neurodivergent, you're probably hearing messages like these online communities are essential for them. They
Right,
might tell you that this is, and that's what I used to say. I used to
right.
feel like, okay, I can express myself in a way on Instagram where I feel far less successful at my ability to do that in a room full of people. And all of those things can be true. And it is a huge tragedy that there aren't better and stronger communities that exist that are safer and not extractive and exploitative. But I believe that it's also true that if your kid is neurodivergent, they're at an increased risk for experiencing negative psychological and learning impacts from smartphone use, as well as negative, serious harms from social media.
Yeah, makes
And it's really
sense.
sad.
It is. I find myself crying a lot these days. It's okay. So, a couple things I wanted to talk to you about around friendships. How you've been through this huge change in your life, your view, your values. How have your friendships changed or not changed over this time?
It's an interesting I appreciate the question. I think this factor of experiencing the autistic burnout and the total functional collapse is such that my capacity to maintain relationships, I think it's just important context that has been severely impacted. My closest friends, very small circle of I'm thinking of 2 or 3 faces that are showing up in my mind right now, and, I have found not much change, right, other than acceptance of this new capacity, and maybe Kelly used to always show up when invited and now she can't, and understanding why that is. Or, my best friend and I, we meet at the same place, same time every week, rain or shine, walk the same loop, and like my brain can handle that. And so there's a real like sense of care and accommodation. And, it's that same friend who came over and helped me think about, you know, right after I filed my lawsuit, how do I talk about this in a way that is aligned with ultimately my kind of intentions around this? And so I just like the support from my closest friends has been amazing. I think, and even the next layer out, like generally the people that I'm thinking about the parents at my kids' school or the people
Mm,
that I have sort of those sort of interactions with, I hear a lot of awe and encouragement of like,
oh,
wow, we just
good,
think what you're doing is so cool. And that's
good.
really great. And interestingly, like the friendships and relationships of people that I cared for over the course of almost 15 years I spent at Meta, in some cases, it's like, they've vanished. And that's no surprise. And,
Mhm.
you know, I I've kind of let people come to me because I'm in the middle of this lawsuit, and talking to me is kind of discoverable, if we're talking about Meta, and so we have to be careful about that. But I have heard from so many people who say things like, I wish that I could do what you're doing.
Mhm.
And the reasons they don't look a lot like feeling like it's not going to make a difference, or worrying, about worrying about the impact to their hireability or kind of career implications. And, those kind of comments are bittersweet, right? Like, I both appreciate where they're coming from and feel really sad that that's the system that we exist in.
Yeah.
Yeah. And,
And the
the other thing I'm thinking about is how many of the people that mean the most to me these days are relationships that have formed in the last year
Mm,
as I've been doing this work. I mean, I think about, I talked about Grace earlier, and her mom, Chris, and I are, we communicate regularly, and she, has invited me to stay with her, and Amy Neville is, I think about, it's really an interesting dynamic. Like, I was emotionally abused and neglected as a kid, and didn't have the kind of parents, who, as much as they, I think, would have liked to, my parents definitely did their best, and I am so grateful for what they gave me. And I didn't have the kind of parents that many of these kids have, who have died, who are, parents who love their kids so much that their lives are now dedicated to preventing these
mm,
harms from happening to other kids. There's something, even though I never got to meet so many of these kids, obviously any kid who's died to social media harms, it's their families that I meet and build relationships with. But um, being seen and cared for and loved by this community has been incredibly meaningful for me. When the internet is full of people that say, she's just looking for a payday, or she made a bunch of money and then lost her job and now she wants to make more money. And it's like, this is a group of people who really understand the consequences of the things that I'm concerned about, and where I could imagine being in their shoes and thinking, screw you. Like, you were part of this evil machine that killed my kid. And the love and care that I feel from them has been overwhelmingly validating, meaningful, healing, and really is it keeps me going. It's like, it's the place where I know that even if the lawsuit gets hard or the legislative stuff gets hard, like, I have to just look at their faces and know exactly why I'm doing this.
that is
These parent survivors are a a group of people like no one you've ever met or imagined. And isn't it interesting that big tech wants us to think that the kids who experience harms like this do so because they come from households that are checked out or void of care or love or concern? And it's like, are you joking? Because these are kids who are so loved that their parents continue showing up for them in these huge and heroic ways, even in the wake of such tragedy.
and it's this type of story that I feel like we cannot forget, because the news is unrelenting with its hate and its greed and this subversion of power. And yet, look at this. Like,
Mm,
look at this healing that's happening and courage in the face of unimaginable loss. I can't I can't wrap
mhm,
my head around it. So I think this is a
mm-mm,
very important part of your story.
mhm. Completely. And it's like, these are individuals with principles that people like Mark Zuckerberg can only dream to have. And these are people who have lost everything, and are mourning their child, and have continue to have more integrity than they do, than Mark Zuckerberg does, than Evan Spiegel does. And I really believe in that. I told in June when I was out in DC advocating for some of this legislation, I met many of them and I told them that, I used to believe that what we were doing was good for the world. And now, I closed my kind of remarks by telling them that I believe now in their love and commitment to protect other kids more than I believe in anything else. It is more powerful and it will win. I'm confident of that. It's just
Mm,
it took a long time to get seatbelt laws. It took a long time to see the truth on cigarettes. And,
mhm.
it might take a really long time. Like even those fights weren't up against money and power like big tech has. But I am confident that this love will win.
Thank you, Kelly. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, and thank you. I mean, I'm so grateful for your care about kind of these breadths of these issues, and, you know, what really excited me after, when I heard from you, and I hear like I said, I've got such limited capacity, and I hear from all sorts of folks, and
I'm sure.
I think there's people that are interested in this topic through the glass. And when I listen to some of your content and some of the decisions that you're making with your own businesses around principles that are going to align with like the evidence and how you're reconsidering like how am I showing up in some of these spaces and what does it mean to be successful without participating in exploitative platforms. And I just really admire that because I think that it's incredibly unusual and exactly the kinds of hard kind of inner and external conversations we need to be having if we want to actually be part of the solution here. And if we think that, that this stuff is bad and a problem and that these social media companies are exploiting and harming our most vulnerable, and we have to come to terms with the fact that we're lining their pockets if we spend time using their products. And I think it's really hard, and I really admire the decisions that you've made.
Thank you. Coming from you with your background and experience to get that affirmation really gives my choices strength and the ongoing evolution of them strength because I'm not in San Francisco or I didn't come from there. I'm just kind of like, what am I going to do? And I'm trying to navigate and when you say no, I agree. Like
Mhm.
when people agree and see it, it's very, very helpful. So thank you for that. And I really, really appreciate your time. It is your work is the minute I read your first work, I knew I wanted to share it with my audience because I feel so clear that the therapy and the personal growth world really needs to get their head around some of these issues so we can stand up for children
Mhm.
and for marginalized groups. So
Right.
thank you again. I'm so glad we're connected.
Yeah, thank you.
Kelly has a Substack and she's a great writer. I highly recommend you check her out at overturned.substack.com. I also invite you to join my newsletter at AlisonCrosswait.com/remembering-newsletter. Both links are in the show notes. And I hope you're taking good care of yourself during these very challenging times. I hope that you find fresh air, a connection, and hugs. And remember to breathe, feel the ground, and remember that we are most definitely not alone.